Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in several sectors of the front line. The Russians have managed to advance in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, in the southwest of Pokrovsk within the town of Uspinivka. The Russians also managed to advance east of Pokrovsk, in the northern flank of Turetsk, as well as in the Chasiv Yar direction. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions on the western bank of the Usk river line, where they continued their counterattack to attempt to dislodge the Russian positions across the Usk river line and push them back across, preventing them from developing offensive operations further beyond the Usk river line. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians continued their offensive operations here in the Zaporizhia region, where they have managed to capture the remaining parts of the farm area and the fortified positions in Lobkove, moving on to the residential area and the northwestern parts of the town, following which the Russians will look to fight over Kamyansk. At the same time, fighting continues in the direction of Meli Sherbaki and Sherbaki, where the Ukrainians have started to send reinforcements for some counterattacks to prevent the Russians from gaining control over both of these towns. And if we take a look at the topographic map, we can see exactly why these towns are important. Meli Sherbaki is located at an elevation of 106 meters, while Sherbaki is located at about 88 meters. Further to the east towards Orehiv, the elevation goes up to about 122 meters, and the areas the Russians were attacking from were at a lower elevation of about 100 meters to 60 meters throughout this section of the front line. We see here Lobkove in the southwest is located all the way down to 28 meters near the Dnieper river line. So we see that the Russians are attempting to gain a foothold in the high ground to the west of Orehiv, where the capture of Meli Sherbaki and Sherbaki will allow the Russians to move on to take control over the high ground near Novoandrivka and Orehiv, to take advantage of the geographical advantages there is with the high ground and for further offensive operations towards Orehiv. It would be very difficult for the Russians to launch offensive operations towards Orehiv without having control over the high ground, and therefore the Russians are fighting over the high ground to the southwest. Control over Meli Sherbaki and Sherbaki would also allow the Russians to gain control of the high ground to the west of Meli Sherbaki and then move onwards towards Kamyansk, taking advantage of the high ground. That is why the Russians here worked on following the capture of the southern parts of Meli Sherbaki to move onwards towards Stepove through the high ground. This allowed them to gain control over Stepove, which is also located at an elevation of 86 meters, which would allow them to take advantage of this high ground position towards Kamyansk. However, the Ukrainians also have positions on the high ground to the north of Kamyansk at an elevation of 90 meters and above. This means that despite the high ground being on the Russian side to the east and to the south of the town, it simply evens out the battlefield for the Russians and the Ukrainians rather than giving one the advantage over the other. Based on this, we see that the Russians are here fighting to gain control over the high ground through Meli Sherbaki and Sherbaki, for further offensive operations towards Novoandrivka to the east, and to gain control over the high ground area near the towns. At the same time, it will allow them to move through Stepove, which is also located at the high ground, to fight towards Kamyansk, which has these two ravines to the northeast and to the southeast of the town through the river lines. This would allow the Russians to have the high ground advantage to the east and to the south of the town, gain control over these parts of the town, and then start fighting over the northern parts, where the Ukrainians have some fortified positions on the high ground to the north of the town. Therefore, the Russians would have the advantage in the east and the south of the town, while the Ukrainians would have the advantage in the northern parts of the town. In the end, these advances near Stepove, Pyatatki, and Lobkove will allow the Russians to regain control over the southern bank of the river line here within Kamyansk and the eastern parts of the town. This will also allow the Russians to strengthen the offensive operations within Meli Sherbaki and Sherbaki, where the Ukrainians are attempting to prevent the Russians from gaining control over the high ground, which would threaten the Ukrainian positions near Novoandrivka, and following that, Orehiv itself. In the eastern section of the front line, near Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over much of the western parts of Uspinivka, leaving just a small part of the town with Ukrainian presences within. This indicates that the Russians will likely gain control over Uspenivka in the coming days, which will allow them to gain control over a heavily contested town, which has been fought over for over 2 months now. And with this, we see that the Russians will continue their offensive operations towards Novoalexandrivka and Novoserhivka. It is unclear exactly where the Ukrainians have their defensive positions prepared, and whether the capture of Uspenivka is due to the fact that the Ukrainians simply do not have the capacity to hold on to these positions anymore and were forced to withdraw, or if the town itself is becoming more undefendable due to the heavy destruction that has raged on for the past 2 months. Due to a lack of information, it is difficult to conclude and therefore difficult to predict what comes next. In the end, we'll have to see what comes next, but the Russians will likely use the forest lines to the southeast of Novoalexandrivka, gain control over the forest line between Uspenivka and that position, and then move along towards Novoalexandrivka from the eastern and southeastern directions. At the same time, gaining control over Uspenivka would secure the northern flank and allow the Russians to advance further in the northwestern direction from Nadiivka and towards Preobrazhenka in the south, as the Russians were forced to slow down the offensive operations further south due to Ukrainian counterattacks, but also due to the fact that their flanks in the north were threatened both on the eastern and western flanks. This forced the Russians to redirect their forces towards Shevchenko and Uspenivka, as well as Kotlina in the northwest. The Russians focused on these locations to secure their bridgehead and the western flank of Pokrovsk. And now that the Russians have regained control over Shevchenko and Kotlina and almost completely captured Uspenivka, it is likely that they will be able to redirect forces back to the south again to continue their offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk border region. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians also managed to gain control over further parts here south of Tarasivka. With this, they have operationally encircled the Ukrainian forces that launched a counterattack south of Volyane towards the fortified positions there. With this, the Russians will likely recapture these fortified positions and then start fighting further within Tarasivka to gain control over the fortified positions within the town and in the western and eastern parts of it, to continue defensive operations towards cutting off the supplies to the Ukrainian positions in the pocket in between Toretsk and the intersection between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, while at the same time the Russians have also managed to gain control over the industrial area within Krymske, and fighting is taking place near the waste heap, where the Russians are here looking to gain full control over the city of Toretsk. And we see that the Russians have regained the initiative in several areas where the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks. However, the Russians do not have the full initiative yet, as the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the direction of Dvorichna, where they've managed to re-enter the town from the western direction. The Russians did not have a large buffer zone, and therefore the Ukrainians had a opportunity to concentrate their forces to the west of the town near the outskirts, and following artillery barrages, they were able to regain a foothold within the town, and fighting has restarted over Dvorichna, which is the center of the supplies of the Russians across the Uskil River line. They are here aiming to stab directly at the heart of the Russian logistics across the Uskil River line. Therefore, the Russians need to either speed up the offensive operations to the north to secure Kamyanka and therefore improve their logistical situation across the Uskil River line, or send additional reinforcements towards Dvorichna to secure the town and then push further ahead to create a wider buffer zone around the town to secure the logistics within their bridgehead. To the Chasiv Yar direction, we see that the Russians have managed to gain control over parts of the southern districts here within the city. The Russians have yet to gain full control over the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, and the Ukrainians still hold their foothold in the northern outskirts, which means they have yet to secure the flanks. However, they have control over the vast majority of the supply routes. There may be some activity by Ukrainian forces, either by drones dropping off ammunition and food to the soldiers, or the forest patches being used under the cover of the trees. In either case, the Russians do not have a full encirclement of the Ukrainian forces, but simply an operational encirclement. However, fighting continues over the apartment complex area. If the Russians gain full control of it and the remaining industrial areas in the western parts of it, the Russians would be able to secure the remaining parts. And with these advances to the south, The Russians are likely indicating that they are soon to gain control over these apartment complex buildings, which will allow them to then push onwards towards Mykolaiivka and gain full control over the city, which will then allow them to launch offensive operations in every direction from it, in the southern, western, and northern directions, to gain control over the fortified positions and high ground in the area. And just to reiterate, the high ground the Russians were gaining control over if they capture the city of Chasiv Yar, we see that at their peak it is 245 meters. There are some areas near Stopushki and in the southern flank that are also located at the high ground, which the Russians would look to gain control over, as well as in the northwestern direction along the main highway as well. So we see that there are several areas Russians would be looking to gain control of, but all of these high ground positions are centered around Chasiv Yar, as well as the canal itself. If the Russians gain control over the city, they'll be expanding through these high ground positions, and then the Russians would have several firing positions overlooking the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, which is all located on the low ground. Also allow the Russians to advance alongside the canal towards the flank of Siversk and encircle the Ukrainian grouping of forces there as well. Despite Chasiv Yar being a small city of a pre-war population of about 12,000 people, it is still an extremely significant one. It has an industrial area, it has an apartment complex area, and it is the center of the high ground along the canal. This is why the city has been fought over for so many years now. Since the fall of Bakhmut in 2023 until now, it has been 2 years almost where the fighting has been centered around the canal and Chasiv Yar, and we'll be now entering a new stage of the fighting near the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, as the Russians will be improving their positions on the eastern flank of these defensive positions, gain control over the Siversk direction as well, and to move onwards to gain control over Liman in the north and Konstantinivka in the south through an encirclement that is bypassing the city itself by gaining control over the remaining areas around Toretsk, the defensive positions in between Toretsk and the intersection, and along the intersection through the highway to the southern flank of Konstantinivka, will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions ahead of a siege of this defensive line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.